The film opens with Craig Bacchus and Denise Balaban listening to a news broadcast about a powerful solar storm hitting Australia, likened to the 1989 geomagnetic storm that caused a blackout in Quebec. A woman has died from the storm. Denise asks if their flight the next day will be affected, and Craig reassures her it won't. Denise seeks affection from Craig, but he reminds her of his decision not to mix love with work. Unfortunately, she kissed him. In Afghanistan, Joan, Elias, Paul, and their team are helping citizens at the Elias Afghan relief camp. Paul informs Joan about a new shipment of poor quality rice. Joan isn't worried, noting they have water purification tablets, but Paul reveals that Mirzad's men hijacked the aid trucks, stealing the high-energy biscuits. Simultaneously, at Roebling Aerospace, Peter Roebling introduced Commander Don Wincroft to reporters and guests. Don warmly welcomed the civilian astronauts, emphasizing they embodied Earth's greatest hopes. Craig appeared uneasy around Don, despite the rest of the crew being confident during interviews. As Craig headed to the station, he met Reggie Walker, the communication technician, who complimented Craig but soon asked him to review his thesis. Craig, focused on the day's mission, advised Reggie to stay on task. Reggie gave Craig his phone number before leaving. While Craig set up at the station, Don arrived, asking irrelevant questions, which annoyed Craig. Don explained he was there as a favor to President Metheny. Craig reminded Don of their spaceflight responsibilities, and Don noted the world was watching. In Washington, D.C., President Metheny watched the live broadcast with his science advisor, Cheryl Wincroft. Metheny remarked on the television's focus on Craig, Cheryl's ex-husband, and Cheryl corrected him, noting their divorce a year ago. The spaceflight's takeoff was successful. Peter recorded video footage of astronaut activities. Everyone was confident except Hernandez, who felt extremely anxious. Meanwhile, the astronauts' families, government officials, and staff celebrated. As the spaceflight continued its ascent, excitement grew as it reached 50,000 feet. Don and Craig had a tense conversation at the station, during which Don mentioned Craig's ex-wife Cheryl. The flight soon achieved low Earth orbit, increasing the crew's and their families' excitement. Peter surprised everyone with champagne in a bag. Meanwhile, Craig called Denise, who teased him about forgetting her. He reassured her and inquired about the ship. Denise playfully scolded him for not asking about her first, but he focused on the mission, asking her to prepare a report on the fuel cells from the Scalar drive and the impact of gravity changes on photonic distribution. Craig received a transmission from Mission Control and commanded the astronauts to initiate the Scalar drive ignition. Captain Fiona pressed the speed button, causing a sudden spike in speed. Craig learned from Mission Control that the spike was due to a wave of cosmic rays. Don's repeated questions went unanswered as Craig focused intensely. At that moment, Cheryl called Don to inquire about the situation. Don replied that a real crisis was unfolding and doubted Craig's ability to manage it. Cheryl informed President Metheny about the cosmic ray storm triggering a Scalar drive malfunction but assured him that all passengers were safe and Mission Control was working on a solution. The atmosphere in Mission Control grew increasingly tense, knowing that continued acceleration would be catastrophic. Don asked Craig if he could assist, and Craig handed him the microphone to contact Mission Control and the astronauts. On the spacecraft, Fiona realized the engine had shut down and lost control. She urgently asked Craig for their trajectory as her instruments failed. In Mission Control, the team escalated the situation by calling President Metheny. Craig informed him the spacecraft was hurtling towards the sun. The president commanded the team to rectify the situation and sent Cheryl to Mission Control for real-time updates. At the Afghan refugee camp, Joan Elias reassured her son, JJ, that she wasn't alone, explaining that governments don't protect people. People protect each other. Their call ended abruptly as Joan's phone lost connection. Back at Mission Control, Cheryl arrived, much to Craig's displeasure. She explained she was there on the president's orders and expressed her gladness that Don and Craig were working together. After some discussion, Craig stepped aside, and Cheryl asked Don about the tension between them. Don admitted that Craig still hated him and didn't like her either. On the spacecraft, pressure mounted as most systems were out of control. Fiona instructed the crew to secure themselves tightly as they approached the solar orbit, trying to stay calm despite the dire situation. Craig called Denise, who asked about firing the thrusters remotely. He said they were working on it and grimly informed her that in 6 days, they would be pulled into the sun, amplifying solar plasma energy. President Metheny was stressed, especially with Cheryl present in his command. Roger consulted with the colonel and decided to put Don in charge of Mission Control. Cheryl informed Craig of this decision, infuriating him. President Metheny, unaware of the change, demanded to know who made the decision. Roger admitted he did, believing it was necessary. In Mission Control, Don asked Cheryl to call Craig back, but she refused, noting Craig's fury. Don contacted Captain Fiona Henslaw, who reported that Peter Roebling had died due to high G-forces. Craig, seeking a solution, called Reggie and instructed him to connect with Denise. Reggie hesitated but complied. Craig asked Denise about the thrusters, but they were still not working. At the Afghan refugee camp, terrorists searched for Nurhan, intending to marry her to a terrorist leader. Joan, unafraid, was warned they would return for Nurhan. Cheryl, reaching out to Craig, overheard Denise's voice from his phone while working on calculations. Don realized Reggie connected Denise with Craig and cut off the call. The thrusters suddenly activated. Craig rushed to mission control, telling Don to instruct Fiona not to fire the thrusters, but she had already engaged the reverse thrusters. JJ called Joan, thrilled to hear her voice. Roger contacted Cheryl for an update, and she informed him that the Scalar drive had been activated instead of the thrusters. On the spaceship, Fiona planned to contact the team via Skype. JJ spoke with his father, Elias, who expressed his love and shared that helping others is the greatest thing one can do. Sadly, the crew said their goodbyes as the spacecraft crashed into the sun. Roger asked President Matheny to sign a document declaring he could no longer discharge his duties due to personal loss. The president, enraged, ordered an emergency message be delivered to all agencies and ordered Roger to leave. Later, Ivans announced to Mission Control that the disaster had missed Earth by 82 degrees laterally. However, the cosmic event caused a massive global electrical failure. Craig warned Don and Cheryl that the sun had gone hyperactive, causing coronal mass ejections and solar flares. He predicted electromagnetic pulses, electrical storms, solar radiation bursts, and possibly earthquakes due to magnetosphere distortion. In the Afghan refugee camp, terrorists were stuck as their truck stopped due to the electromagnetic pulse. The global situation worsened, and tensions rose in the mission center. Cheryl advised Craig to stop blaming Don and focus on fixing the issues. President Metheny's daughter, Lara, was missing, but Roger suggested she might be in the White House. The president left the operations center to search for her, despite the ongoing crisis. Evans announced to Craig and the staff that the worst-case scenario was confirmed. The solar impact's intensity would increase, disrupting all communications and rendering satellites non-functional. The sun's emission of subatomic particles would continue to bombard Earth, potentially leading to the planet's sterilization. Craig addressed everyone, urging them to go home and spend time with their families, knowing there was nothing more they could do. However, Reggie stayed behind. Craig approached him, urging him to leave and be with his loved ones. Reggie replied that his family was in Portland. Craig then asked if there was anyone he wanted to spend his final days with, and Reggie admitted there was, but she wasn't with him. Craig shared that he was in a similar situation. Later, Craig found Don and Cheryl. Don complimented Craig, calling him the smartest person he had ever met, and insisted they weren't done yet. However, Craig dismissed Don's optimism, stating that the sun's immense power was beyond their control. He commanded Don to take Cheryl with him, threatening to do it himself if Don refused. Despite their strained relationship, both Don and Cheryl urged Craig to join them. Craig refused, and Cheryl kissed him in front of Don before they left, taking an old photograph from him as they departed. President Metheny found his daughter, Lara, in the White House. She was crying, having never faced such a dire situation before. The storms outside were raging. Lara apologized to her father for previous disagreements, and Metheny comforted her. Craig had a breakthrough and confronted Don about why NASA wanted his knowledge of scalar drive technology. Don admitted they had modified Craig's plan to increase energy output without his approval. Realizing they had a potential solution, Craig and Cheryl set things in motion to save the world. Don explained that NASA and the Air Force had taken Craig's design, modified it, and it could reach the sun in 9 hours. Cheryl informed the president of their solution. In the Afghan refugee camp, an electrical storm had caused many deaths. Paul, injured, called for his colleague Rebecca, but Joan told him she didn't survive. Joan urged Paul to focus on saving lives and suggested negotiating with Mirzad for bunkers, possibly using his daughter to persuade him. Cheryl informed the president that their plan was the only way to save the world. Trusting their judgment, the president authorized the X-57 to be fueled and ready. Roger, who opposed the decision, was sent to the executive briefing room in frustration. Meanwhile, JJ survived the electric storm and heard cries for help. He found people trapped in an elevator and promised to rescue them. During their journey, Don and his team discussed various matters. Reggie asked Craig to drive, but he became tired after a few miles. Cheryl offered to take over, but Craig refused. Cheryl apologized for leaving him for his best friend, and Craig acknowledged they were still friends. In the bunkers, Jose's wife Marta and her community pooled resources to distribute food evenly. Marta's mother, Gloria, became angry about the limited food. The community leader tried to calm her, pointing out that her anger stemmed from Jose's death, despite her never really liking him. Craig and his team continued on foot after their car stopped due to electrical storms, with only 25 miles left. Desperate, they took an old man's car to speed up their journey. In the refugee camp, Paul, injured and unable to keep up, urged Joan to leave him and save others. Despite her hesitation, Joan decided to focus on saving as many people as possible. As Craig's team approached Eden Town, they found it closed off. After a heated argument, a young guard shot Don in the shoulder. Craig disarmed the guard and took Don to the healthcare center. The town leader eventually allowed them to resume their journey to the Air Force Base. At the base, Craig was surprised to see his designs in use but noticed a problem. It required 2 command officers to simultaneously turn key switches located more than 6 feet apart. Craig and Don prepared to handle the situation, needing another person to help. As Don and Craig prepared for the mission, Don kissed Cheryl goodbye, making Craig uncomfortable. Cheryl stopped Craig from walking away and explained that she left him because she felt unworthy, and Craig admitted he left her for similar reasons. She handed him a picture he had given her, and Craig walked away ready for the mission. Don and Craig started the engine and began their journey. They briefly lost consciousness at high altitude and found themselves outside Earth's atmosphere, heading toward the sun when they awoke. Meanwhile, Lara was talking to her father, President Metheny, when Roger pretended to be confused and then grabbed a gun from a soldier. He attempted to shoot the president and persuade the security guards to his side, but a quake disrupted his plans. The guards overpowered Roger and took him away. Joan and the Afghan refugees arrived at the bunkers. Joan pleaded with Nurhan's father for food and shelter, but he demanded something in return. Joan offered him his daughter, Nurhan. Remembering past faults, he decided to punish her and handed a gun to Joan, telling her to kill Nurhan for food and shelter. If she refused, he would kill Nurhan himself and send Joan and her people back to the desert. Joan hesitated but ultimately killed Nurhan. Her father then commanded his guards to provide Joan and her people with whatever they needed. Meanwhile, Craig and Don were doing everything they could to solve their predicament. Craig suggested flipping the ship around so the tail faced the sun, using the nuclear pulse shield as a solar shield, and flying backward. They executed this maneuver successfully. However, Craig soon realized that the Scalar bomb was not coming online, and he couldn't open the cargo bay doors. He explained to Don that without opening the doors, they couldn't eject the bomb. Determined to ensure the mission's success, Craig decided to open the doors manually, even if it meant sacrificing his life. Don protested, asking if there was another way or offering to do it himself, but Craig insisted on doing it. He manually ejected the bomb into the sun, ensuring its detonation. Don, devastated but determined to honor Craig's sacrifice, immediately piloted the ship back to Earth. Finally, the movie concludes with the two legends, Craig and Don, successfully solving the crisis. The world returns to normal, as it was before the solar disaster. Cheryl waits with hopeful anticipation at the Air Force camp, believing that Craig and Don will return. Don arrives at the camp alone, and Cheryl is saddened by the sight. In a poignant moment, Don hands Cheryl the photograph she had given to Craig before they embarked on their mission. With that, the movie ends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching. See you next time.